Welcome, everyone, to the February 8th Eugene City Council work session. Welcome to everyone here and at home. And we're going to switch items A and B. So the first, and then I'm going to try to hold us to the time, and if we need more time for one of these, then I might have to take some time out of the later meeting, but I've been trying to go through all three of these. So the first item up is the work session on the Federal Service Transportation Program, or STIP. And I guess before I turn it over to you, I would make the comment that Alan and I both serve on the MPC, and our responsibility is to represent what you want at the MPC. And I felt like I wanted to be sure that you had several years ago made a commitment to using flexible dollars in the STIP for road preservation because of our huge backlog. And I guess my concern was that everybody be aware of that and how that would affect what we did on MPC. And then secondly, for at least there to be some discussion about whether that's still how you wanted it to be that tight for preservation, or did you want to leave some flexibility for something else that might come along that might suit the city's interest. And as you saw, I think in my communication to you, I guess the only other thing I would say before they begin is that we get many streams of funding that go into transportation, and many needs to be met across those streams. And so the question for STIP, which is actually in this case a relatively small amount of money, is do you want to constrain it so it cannot, from our position, so that it cannot be used for anything other than road preservation, or do you want to say road preservation is a top priority but leave some flexibility for something else? So that's why I brought it before you, so we were making a conscious decision whether we're using our money to drive the kind of decision making that we want to have for our community. City Manager.
Thank you, Mayor, and I'll just turn it over to Mark Shoney, City Engineer, for a presentation.
Thank you, John. Mayor Percy and members of the council. So the Metropolitan Planning Organization has initiated the process to allocate federal STP, or Surface Transportation Program, urban funds for federal fiscal years 11 to 13, with the Metropolitan Policy Committee scheduled to take action on that allocation on April 8th. Under the existing framework, somewhere between $3.18 and $5.28 million will be available in the category that's for project development, preservation, and modernization projects. And as the Mayor mentioned, the Council established a policy back in April of 2009 that federal transportation dollars, whether they're or flexible transportation dollars, whether they're federal, state, or local, should be allocated to pavement preservation unless an exception is directed by the City Council. So consistent with that council policy, the city staff developed a list of 3 pavement preservation projects, and we kind of put them in priority order, and with Coburg Road being the highest priority, primarily because it's the section that is between 2 segments that are scheduled to be maintained with the pavement preservation bond measure. So this would fill in that gap between those 2 bond measure projects. And then Martin Luther King Boulevard and Hilliard Street. And the sum total of these projects is $2.77 million, which is about half the higher amount of that range that I said earlier of at the $5.28 million. And consistently over the years that we've allocated, or that the Metropolitan Policy Committee has allocated federal funds, the City of Eugene has received about half those funds. So the 3 projects add up to a little more than half of the higher end range of that money that's under the existing framework could be allocated to project development, modernization, and pavement preservation. And so the importance of maintaining that existing policy of the City Council is that at the time the Council established the policy, the pavement preservation backlog was $94 million. And then the most recent time we've updated our pavement management system, last year the pavement preservation backlog exceeded $170 million. So we've made, even though that backlog has increased dramatically since the policy was established, we still have made quite a bit of progress, as you all saw in our road tour this past fall, and we've established quite a few funding sources between the federal Surface Transportation Program dollars, the local gas tax, the pavement bond measure, the reimbursement component of the transportation SDC, which, when that was established as a source for pavement preservation, we were estimating $700,000 in annual revenue, but with the decline in development, that number has dropped down to somewhere between $150,000 and $200,000 a year. And then, so even though we've made all that progress, we still have not established a long-term, sustainable, locally controlled source of funds for pavement preservation. And so that's why the staff recommendation is to continue with the pavement preservation for the federal Surface Transportation Program urban funds. And at your places this evening was a memo that I put together this afternoon in request from Councilor Ellen Zelenka about how much have we spent on bicycle and pedestrian improvements. So in that memo, I just quickly looked at the last 5 years, the fifth year being the year that this construction season we're coming up to. So that total, and I didn't total it on that table, but it totals $12.5 million, which is about $2.5 million annually, and that represents a wide source of funds, or a wide range of funding sources, including federal transportation enhancement funds, federal earmark funds, federal Surface Transportation Program urban funds, some of the stimulus funds that came to the city this past year, ODOT bike and ped grant funds, the bond measure, transportation system development charges, community development block grant funds, and most recently a grant that we heard about last week was the Safe Routes to School program, which is a new state program using federal funds. So that's a wide range of funds for those different bicycle and pedestrian improvements. And what's not included in that summary is the bicycle and pedestrian improvements we put together on some of the urban standard projects like the Courthouse District, Crest Friendly, and Story Boulevards, Maple Elmira, Chad Drive, all of the urban standard projects, or the funds we've used for accessible pedestrian signals and access ramps. And those have primarily been community development block grant funds. So again, the staff recommendation is to continue the focus on pavement preservation with this source of federal funds. And attached to your agenda item summary is some alternatives, if you wish to consider alternatives to pavement preservation. There's a group of bicycle and pedestrian or bicycle projects that focus on bikeways. There's a second group that would focus on including bicycle or pedestrian enhancements on the pavement preservation projects. And then there's a set on moving towards an intelligent transportation system, so it would be establishing the kind of the backbone along Coburg Road, which would require trenching, so it would be a good project to do in advance of the pavement preservation project. So that would focus on safety, improving safety, and reducing congestion on that corridor through the use of intelligent transportation system technology. And then finally, we talked a little bit about the West 11th Corridor study and the completion of that and the suite of projects that came out of that study, but felt that the timing isn't quite right for that until the council and the MPC and LTD agree on a alignment for the West Eugene MX expansion, because it would change how we fund those projects and how we proceed with those projects, depending on which alignment is chosen. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. George?
The alternative projects, would that be in addition to the $2.77 million that we're going to try to secure, or would some of that be in lieu of that 2.7?
It would be in lieu of that 2.7.
Okay. Is there a possibility that we could get more than that 2.77? I know you said based on historical data that usually is somewhere in the middle. Does it look like we could possibly get closer to the 5.28 that you've got in the AIS, or is it?
Historically, the way it has played out is that the Metropolitan Policy Committee will program at the lower level, and then as federal funds become more certain, they'll do a smaller, separate process to allocate those funds.
Well, we've received a number of emails from people in response to the Sustainability Commission's recommendations, and they're very noteworthy, and I think it's a good idea. However, based on our current backlog and our commitment by a previous council, and the fact that we still have that commitment in place, I think at this time it'd be best if we allocated the STIPU money as indicated by staff. Maybe at a later time, or if some more money becomes available, we can kick in a couple extra projects. But I think at this point, it's important that we maintain the current infrastructure that we have, because without a good infrastructure, you're not going to get whether you walk, ride a bicycle, ride a bus, or drive a car, your life is affected by the current infrastructure that we have in place right now, and it's important that we maintain that. So I'm in support of the staff recommendation, and I recommend that we try to get some extra money and maybe dedicate some of that to some of the alternative projects.
I got Mike in the queue, but before that, I just wanted to point, I want to say to you, and I think that Ellen would say the same thing on MPC, that unless you tell us differently, I think we're both supportive of the projects that are in front of us. That, to me, wasn't the question, and not even the priority of preservation was the question. The question was, were we giving ourselves enough flexibility in the guidelines that we were giving MPC, so they could, if they saw something that they needed to move on, whether we would have the ability to do that within the guidelines of what our priorities are. So that was the question. And I think it's really important, and I appreciate Alan putting this list forward, and I hope, Alan, since you asked for it, you may want to read it to people, but I actually think this is a pretty substantial list of bike projects, and I really wouldn't want people to think that if we went ahead and said that we want to support these projects, that it doesn't mean that we don't have a really aggressively strong commitment to building our bike infrastructure. And this is an example of that. It's just that there are other sources that we can go to for building our bike infrastructure that was not available for pavement preservation. And so trying to take all those different streams we have and make them build what we need in complete is what we are talking about today. Mike.
Thank you, Mayor. My comments would parallel George's. I look at this list, and it's an impressive one. I think this shows our leadership as a community on these things, and I think they're a tremendous value to everybody in the community, no matter your opinion on other matters. I think we all kind of value the opportunity to get out and enjoy this level of infrastructure, and it's superior, and we're leaders because of it. My concerns are making sure that we maintain the preservation piece as a very high priority right now, because some of that stuff has been, I don't think we've kept up as we should with that, where we're leading in this. And so it seems a higher priority to me from the standpoint of cost. With some of those things, if we're not addressing them quickly enough, the cost of replacement over time becomes much, much more expensive, and then we lose our ability to do some of these other things as well. So I think the price of waiting or not having those as a priority is too high. So I would support the staff's recommendation as well to maintain the priority schedule alone without the flexibility.
Chris.
Thank you. I think there's really, I guess there's two things that are swirling around. The first one is with regard to the motion that will at some point be put on the table. The second question is, what is the degree of flexibility you want to have when you go back to your groups? And we could actually ask that same question for all of us when we go back to our groups. What is the flexibility we have? And I think that's a really good question. And I don't have a good solid answer, because the only thing I can think of is, well, it really depends. I trust you and Alan to have the best interests of the city. I also trust you and Alan to kind of have a good sense of where the council discussion has gone. So if, from the standpoint of saying flexibility within knowing where we generally are and not going somewhere afield, I'm absolutely comfortable with. I think if the rule says this, and if something isn't defined by the rule, I don't think you have to run back to us every single time as long as you have a clear understanding of where the discussion's going. And I think generally you do. I can't imagine you going off in a weird direction. With regard to this measure, or whatever motion's going to go on the table, for me the sentiment is not a question of I want this but I don't want that. It's really a matter of I want this and I want this and I want this, and I don't have enough money to have them all right now. How do I organize them? That's one of the interesting things about the job is to have to choose between things you want. And in this case, because the backlog is so significant and impacts so many people, to me it's still the number one priority. Doesn't mean I don't want to do these other improvements. I do. But as George pointed out, if we can find other sources of money, or if there's other grants we can pursue, or in another round, that might be a good discussion to have. But I'm just trying to keep my eye on the ball. And right now the ball is getting that $170 million worth of street backlog under control. And I unfortunately can't really focus on anything else right now until I get a good bite out of that one.
Alan?
Mark, thank you very much for the memo. $12.5 million over the 5 years spanning right now through 2010 is a significant amount of money on say it's 15 different projects, ranging from the bridge over the Delta Pond Bridge to safe routes to schools to sidewalks to bike paths and all sorts of things. So we do spend a lot of money on bikes, but it is also we spend an enormous amount of money on cars, so to me, the issue is one of a little bit of flexibility. When I read the policy, it says preservation or operations, maintenance, preservation of existing capital transportation infrastructure. It doesn't say roads. It says transportation infrastructure. And transportation infrastructure, I think, should be construed in this case as broadly as possible to include bikes and pedestrian path, because those are part of our transportation system. As we were working through all the stuff that we worked through on the Transportation System Funding Committee, we were talking about buses, bikes, peds, and cars, as well as the ability of trucks to get around. I guess for the road specifically, we've gone for the levy. We're looking at the street utility fee, which is coming back to us soon. We did actually have $350,000 as a part of that road levy goes specifically every year to bike and ped maintenance. And those projects are identified. This last year we did the Amazon Trail, and next year we're doing
The Fern Ridge and
Fern
the
Ridge.
Westmoreland connector.
Right. The issue here at MPC really is that there's very little discretionary money, and there are really important issues that come up that might be constrained by this policy that we have, which was before I came on the council, and specifically two that are really important. One is LTD and keeping the buses, and we all just read about the $6 million deficit they're having in the routes that they may have to cut, which hurts the people who need it the most, who can least afford alternatives. And then also other important issues like the emerging issues around greenhouse gas planning and the task force that I sat on for the governor with regard to land use planning and transportation planning. And so those things are kind of the emerging needs that we have. And I think this policy ends up constraining us a little bit for important things like that. I'll need a second.
Thank you. George?
I just got a couple questions. Were step youth funds used for any of these projects on this list? I don't think that you said that they were.
They were used for the North Bank path overlay.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
So-
Monroe Finley
All right, there's a precedent.
There's
then
like
for
4, yeah.
using them.
Yes.
Well, I was just looking at this list of the 3 priority projects, and then I see that the total is 2.77 million. We're going to shoot for at least 3.8. Would it hurt to add a couple of bike projects, but they would be like priority 4 and 5 on that list? A couple from the alternative projects, and it would still be underneath the minimum of what we expect to receive. Could we mix the requests?
Well, we're a little bit over
Or is it too?
the 2.7, so the 5.28 million is the amount under the existing framework that would be shared by all of the
Oh, I see.
MPO area
Okay.
communities, Springfield, Lane County, us, Coburn.
That's not
for-
PG&E.
Right.
Right.
And historically, we've averaged about half of the allocation. or about-
Okay, so we can realistically expect to get maybe 2 of these, 2 of the 3 projects? the
Probably.
priorities? Okay. So it'd be unrealistic to add.
I think so.
We would want it. If we wanted to
Substitute.
put bikes up on, we would have to take one of these off and add 2 or 3 bike projects.
Yes.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Debbie?
Is Martin Luther King Boulevard in bad shape? I didn't think it was.
It's, no, all these projects are to roads that, in that whole discussion about pavement
Yeah.
preservation, where we would do an overlay prior to the road
Right.
structure failing and the,
Well, I can see that Hilliard might fail, but I didn't know that that one
There's a
would.
loop.
But that one also, is it as bad as Hilliard?
no, it's not as bad as Hilliard, but it would, so that the treatment may not be as extensive.
I think Hilliard should be high on the list. It's really falling apart. But I wouldn't be in favor of flexibility that let us use this money for new roads. But as long as it's for preservation or more bicycle paths, I think I would be in favor of being more flexible. But what I would like is I think when we originally established this, it was the idea that we would not spend any of that money for building more roads. And that part, I think, should stay. So,
Andrea?
Thank you, Mayor. So I'm just looking at this list of Attachment A, alternative projects for STIPU funding, and the first paragraph talks about a pedestrian and bicycle master plan update. The 3 examples that are given here in the attachment really aren't as comprehensive as all that. And for me, when I think about if we are going to look for ways to increase people's usability of our bike paths, West Eugene is sorely underutilized, and I don't see anything here reflecting that. And so I would be looking to that master plan to see how people can get safely from West Eugene to, closer to town. I mean, because I think it's a real challenge for folks out that way. I'm for having a conversation about a little bit of flexibility within our direction to you, Mayor and Alan, but I'm also of the mind that I think that we need to address the roads and the pothole issues and infrastructure. I'm not for allowing new roads just yet. I don't think we're there yet. And I did want to comment that just an aside note, I don't know how much time I have, but there was a Sentinel event in my neighborhood, and I went looking around in the area, and I noticed the road was paved last second from Cleveland down to Garfield was paved, and so that was kind of nice to see that had been done. I wasn't aware that it had been paved, so thank you.
I wanted to make you aware of, right now, when we've been working on this STIP-U funds at MPC, there's been a discussion about not only being really conscious that we're trying to move things in the direction that we want to move them in terms of preservation and greenhouse gas emission reductions and things of that sort, but it's also trying to measure, use some metrics to see what we're accomplishing. So I'm going to pass around, this is a draft application that a subgroup of MPC put together where you can sort of mark off on this, on any project, how this is sort of moving the dial, so to speak. And we're going to try, I think it's going to come before MPC this week for approval. And the idea, I think, is going to be that it will be used as a pilot to see if we can actually get some measurements about what we're accomplishing with our dollars. So I'll pass this around for you guys to look at. Alan, second round.
Yeah, Mark, can you describe the process that this funding goes through? We make our recommendations, then it goes where, and then MPC?
So if you turn to the second page of the agenda item summary is the timeline, and I'll kind of walk through the process on that. It's gotten a little compressed in it because it was anticipated that the Metropolitan Policy Committee would adopt a framework in January, and that got postponed or pushed over until February. So the idea is that they would adopt a framework for, and that's really what categories and how much in each of the categories. And then they solicit applications. So if you approve us moving forward with the pavement preservation or whatever suite of projects, then we would fill out applications and get that completed by the 26th of February. And then what got compressed is the Transportation Planning Committee doing more rigorous analysis of those applications. But the Metropolitan Policy Committee would hold a public
Which
hearing.
is staff from jurisdictions.
Right. Yeah, exactly. The public hearing on March 11th, and then the Citizens Advisory Committee to the Metropolitan Policy Committee would develop a recommendation at their meeting on the 18th. The Transportation Planning Committee, as you mentioned, the staff group, would develop their recommendation on the 25th, with the Metropolitan Policy Committee making a decision on April 8th.
So all the jurisdictions make their recommendations, the staff committee gets together, sorts them out, makes a recommendation, and the MPC actually makes the final decision.
That's correct.
So, so I asked Mark earlier today about these two projects in Attachment A that are the same as the projects that are on the recommended list, the Martin Luther King Boulevard corridor and the Coburg Road corridor. And these two projects, you said, cost about $100,000 apiece. Do you have a better?
Yeah, somewhere we haven't scoped them out in great detail. They would be in conjunction with the paving project, so they wouldn't be standalone projects. But somewhere in that range of 100 to 200,000.
Right, and they would be more cost effective if we did it in conjunction with the payment projects, because they would be wrapped up together in the same projects, and would actually make them a better project, a bigger bang for the buck. The fact that the policy actually says existing capital transportation infrastructure, and we have actually done STIP funds for bicycle projects, leads me to want to include these two projects in the existing two projects that we have, so that the Martin Luther King Boulevard project includes this Martin Luther King Corridor Bike and Ped project, as well as the Coburg Road incorporates this Coburg Road Corridor project, and that we just bump those two costs up by about $100,000 and forward that to the MPC, or forward that to TPC, and then deal with it at MPC. And there's always this trade-offs that occur to get to the limited amount of money that we have versus the overabundance of projects that are wanting to share that money. And again, you know, ours is between 3.18 and 5.28 we're not exactly sure how much we're going to get. So there'll be a readjustment at the same time. So when the time comes, if it's not put in the motion, I'll add those as amendments to those two.
Andrea?
So maybe you said this, Alan, and I just didn't hear. So if we were to take these projects on alone, they cost more? Like outside of this?
If you did them as separate projects, it'd be the opportunity to do those pedestrian bicycle improvements would be most cost effective to do it with the pavement preservation.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, you ready to put the motion on?
Yeah, well, just one last question for Mark first, though. Will it increase the chance that we would not do either of the, or any of these projects to the degree that they could fail and we could end up spending a great deal more money later. That likelihood is small, I'm taking it.
Yes.
Okay. Then I'd be happy to add that to the motion and perhaps in this form. Move to approve submittal of STIPU funding application for a Hilliard Street, Martin Luther King Boulevard, and Coburg Road pavement preservation projects, as well as the pedestrian and bicycle projects on Martin Luther King and Coburg.
Second.
Moved and seconded. George?
Is it possible to, if it doesn't look like we're going to get full funding, to drop these last two projects off? In other words, if they say, well, you're going to come up $200,000 short, so rather than not have any of the projects at all, can we drop those last two off and be able to slide in and get the funding for the other three projects?
Well, the way I heard the discussion, I think what we would end up doing would be to either scale back the scope of Coburg. You really can't scale back because you've got the bond measure project on either end. We'd scale back, we'd probably drop Hilliard or scale back the length of Martin Luther King first before we'd take off the concept of adding the pedestrian bike enhancements to Martin Luther King and Coburg.
Say that again? I'm sorry.
So if you go with the staff recommendation, there's still this process where it ends up with the Metropolitan Policy Committee making a decision. So all three of those projects might not get funded. And so what I said earlier is we would look at Coburg first, then Martin Luther King, then Hilliard. There's also the opportunity that if we wanted to fund all three, we put in more local funds to make up that gap. The discussion that I just heard on the bicycle and pedestrian enhancements on Coburg and MLK, that would lead me to, regardless of how we come out of funding, is that we go forward with those pieces. If it means dropping Hilliard, we would do that. If it means scaling back the scope of the pavement preservation on MLK, Martin Luther King, we would do that. But based on the discussion I heard, we'd keep in the 100 to 200,000 on those two roads for bicycle and pedestrians.
So the likelihood would be then that just Hilliard project would be dropped off because that basically covers the estimated or guesstimated amount for the two bicycle projects.
Right.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, and I had, was there, Alan? Yeah.
So the other thing that's important, George, is that we don't know how much we're going to get. It's between 3.18 and 5.28. So that means if roughly half of that, our share, would be somewhere between 1.6 and 2.6 million. The staff proposals for 2.8 million, 2.77, and we had the 200 grand for these. We're at 2.97. So without these projects, we'd be in the position of having to deal with that inequity and possibility that we'd only get half the money that there is available for these projects. So there's some adjustments that we need anyway, and then they don't tend to be all or nothing. They tend to be reorganized to fit the funding available. So it's not like we need 1.7 million, and if we don't get 1.7 million, then we don't do the project. It's more like if we get 1.6, we can still do it. We'll just do something a little different. So they still go forward. They just don't go forward at the same frame, and we might not get. If it comes in at if the money from STIPU comes in at 3.2 million total, then we're down to one project anyway.
And that happens all the time.
And that happens, yeah, it's happened all 3 years I've been doing.
Yeah. Chris?
So just to be clear, the way the motion is, if we don't get the funding to cover what we just put on the table, the first thing that would be removed would be the Hilliard project. If we don't get enough to do the remaining two projects, then what comes off of that is the bikeway enhancements?
What I heard was we would reduce the scope of, we'd keep the pedestrian and bike regardless, and we would reduce the scope of the Martin Luther King project. So maybe we wouldn't go all the way to Interstate 5, or maybe we would go all the way to Centennial Loop on the other end.
And I'm just curious, why would you make that choice as opposed to not doing, I mean, I don't know enough about engineering to know why you choose one over the other.
One,
One aspect of Martin Luther King over the other. In other words, here's the Martin Luther King project. I can remove pieces of it because I don't have enough money. You can remove the piece that's the pedestrian and bikeway that we just added to the motion, or I can make it shorter. Why would, as a traffic engineer or a road construction person, why would you choose to make it shorter instead of taking out the bike enhancement? Is it because of what you think you're hearing from us, or is it because there's an engineering reason?
No, because what I'm hearing from the conversation.
Are you done, Chris?
Well, I guess I would just add a comment. Somebody would have to tell me what's the impact of making it shorter versus removing the bicycle. In other words, I want to do the project that's going to have the best outcome. And everybody in here is going to argue which is the better outcome, but I would be interested in knowing what's the material impact of not making the project as long. I mean, if you end it here instead of ending it here, is that going to have, what kind of impact does that have?
Well, I think what we would end up doing is we'd end up putting local gas tax money in to make it a complete project, and then something else would go away. Some other project would get, that we're not even talking about tonight, some other pavement preservation project funded by a local gas tax would go away, or would get delayed.
John?
So are you saying, Mark, for example, the Coburg Road is $700,000. If you add the bike, that's another $100,000.
Right.
So the first $800,000 that comes in the door would do the Coburg Road plus the pedestrian and bike.
Yes.
Right. And then the MLK project is 1.8 plus another 100,000, so that's 1.9. If we got another 1.9, you'd do that whole project. But if you only got 1.5, what you'd probably do is backfill the rest, the 400,000 with some other funding source to make up the difference in that.
Correct.
Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes.
As opposed to dropping off a part of the project, there would just be another funding source to fill that project, and then that somewhere else there's, that impacts some other project, right? So that's the.
Exactly.
Well, I guess I just want to be clear, since what you're making that judgment on is what you think you're hearing here, then I want to be very clear about what I'm saying, and that is, I'm more than willing to support the addition of those things into this motion, but if you have to back stuff out, I also would prefer to back those two things out before I start shortening projects and domino affecting other things. So I'm more than happy to put them in, but it's LIFO for me on this. If we add them in, that's fine, but if we don't get enough money, they're the two that come back out in order to fund the projects that were still there.
Okay.
Betty?
Why is Hilliard at the bottom of the list?
Well,
Bikes go on Hilliard too, by the way.
right. I mean, Coburg was at the top of the list again because it was that gap between the two bond measure projects, and it's the one that was discussed with the council last fall when we had additional funds that were prioritized to another project. The difference between Hilliard and Martin Luther King is more about the magnitude. One is a $1.8 million project, and the other is a $270. So we wanted to have a range of project sizes to be able to kind of put the pieces together. And it looks like the pieces will come together for the larger two projects.
So when does Hilliard get fixed?
I don't know the answer off the top of my head.
It is dangerous for cars and bicyclists, actually.
And Hilliard's a long section of street, and we did a good piece of it, 13th to 24th a couple years ago, and then in the bond measure we have 24th south, I think all the way to 30th or 31st.
I can show you deep potholes past there.
Yeah.
So I just want to make a point here, and two points. One is what constitutes a real road, real road, in terms of what we think of in our planning process, is a road that not only takes cars on it, but takes bikes on it and is safe for pedestrians to go across. So it's supposed to do, so it has a multimodal purpose. And secondly, I think what you're in, what the bike, especially the bike community, but the larger community, I think, supports is a multimodal road system to the extent that we could put that in place. And what you're being asked by the Sustainability Commission is, as you think about roads, that you think of them in that context, that they are, it's not a fluffy thing that you add on the side, that it's what you're trying to make your transportation system do in the community. So that's one thing for you to think about. The other is what Mark said earlier, is that if you don't do it now and you try to put it in later, I suppose you could ask him to calculate what the cost of that, what the additional cost of that would be. So you build this road now and you make the decision to not put these other parts in it, but you have in your list that those are coming, we want those, that they're on this other page on the list. So then when you're going to put those in, what are you going to do? Go back and do something that's going to add a lot more overall cost to it, because you're doing it essentially in two steps instead of one step. That would be accurate to say, right? Yep. So that's I think you just ask you to look at it from both of those. It's not short shrifting good road surface. It's really about what it is you're trying to build and whether you're going to use this effort to move in that direction, and does this make good sense to be doing it in this way? That's kind of the question at hand. Alan and then Mike.
So there are so many streets that we need to fix that, taking one off and pushing it out is like taking a bucket of water out of the ocean and saying, oh, we reduced the level of the ocean. That's almost how I feel about how much work we need to do. And Bay, the Hilliard project is only from 13th Avenue to Franklin, right around the hospital. It doesn't go anywhere south of the university or south of the hospital. So it's just that 3-block section that's in this, that this project is identified as. And the 24th, the area below down by Amazon Park is actually scheduled for next year to be a reconstruction project. And inconvenience us all that live in that part of town. I kind of like the idea of taking 5 or 10% of STIPI money and putting it to bike-to-ped projects. And that's about kind of what we're doing here. It's kind of a ratio that I tried to do when I suggested we take $350,000 a year for bike and ped in the road levy that passed as well. The other thing is, we're not likely to get all this money we're asking for. We actually, I don't think we've ever gotten all the money we've asked for. We always are in this readjustment process. And I guess the final part is, the reason that these projects were in attachment A is because if they're coordinated with these existing projects, then they're cheaper to do than if we had to do them later. So it's more cost effective to include them now than it is to do them later, which is why they're in attachment A. And so I think that's really a smart use of our money and forward thinking.
All right, Mike?
Yeah, Mark, is it more cost effective to build these in and short the distance of Martin Luther King, or the other way around?
You wouldn't actually short.
No, I think I don't think we would. I think what we would end up doing is putting in local gas tax and delaying another project.
Well, and then in that case, because of the length, the backlog, and we have other options for these projects, as we've done with all those that we've accomplished in the last few years, I'm wondering, do you need that last in, first out sort of idea that Chris mentioned as a part of this motion in order to have that as direction on it? If one of them wanted to make that amendment?
Well, seeing as the heads were nodding in different directions when that discussion was occurring, it would be...
Well, I would say that if George or Chris wanted to make that amendment at that time.
The one piece that could be difficult, and I'm not going to speak for Mark, is all these projects do become a little bit fluid, because ultimately you have a certain amount of money that you're trying to fit to the project, and as they're going through that distribution process, and so maybe it's helpful, or I don't know if that's easier or harder if you have something that specific with that or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would, earlier Councilor Pryor said he would trust the mayor and Alan, and I'm assuming that same would go, that you would trust the staff, so I'd be comfortable without that specific direction, that we could, as through this process, we could make a good judgment on that, without the specific direction.
Chris?
And I'm willing to reinforce that. It's not that I know enough about streets to know if making this longer is better than putting in this pedestrian thing. I mean, I'm willing to say, you look at this project, you know what it is we want to accomplish. We want it to be a good street that does the job it's supposed to do in the best possible terms. If you really legitimately believe that this pedestrian enhancement is a more cost-effective route to go than maybe doing this, if you really believe that and the engineering supports you, that's okay. What I don't want to do is do it because it's politically the right thing to do. I want to do it because it's structurally, engineering-wise, and from the standpoint of actual functionality, the right thing to do. And I'm willing to put that in your hands. That's okay.
George?
The actual projects themselves, that's repairing the street or doing work on the street from curb to curb, is that correct?
That's correct.
So the part of the street that the bicycles will be riding on is between those two curbs, is that correct?
That's correct.
All right.
Well, not entirely. On Martin Luther King, it's actually, the sidewalk was built as a combined sidewalk and bikeway.
Okay, so I'm just looking at the description of the alternative projects, and it says, for like the Coburg Road corridor, could include visual countdown signals, access management where there are willing property owners, and bicycle wayfinding signage. And on the Martin Luther King, it's enhanced pedestrian crossings at the east end of the corridor coordinated with pavement preservation. To me, that doesn't sound like it's between the curbs where the real repair work needs to be done. So I want to make it very clear that if we're not going to get the full amount that we need, that the first two things that go off the list are these two, the bicycle pedestrian enhancements that we've added on. I want that made perfectly clear, and if it has to be in a form of a motion, I will do it that way, because I think that the primary need for that money the primary purpose for that money needs to be fixing the streets, and that's what the people have been hammering at us for the last umpteen years, is fix the streets. They don't want signs, they want good streets. So if there's a question of whether or not that money comes off first, let me know, and I'll put it in the form of a motion.
Well, the motion's on the table.
Call the question.
George, I don't think it's clear.
Then I will offer a friendly amendment to make that perfectly clear, that if the complete funding is not there, that the last two projects we've added on are the first two off.
Second.
That was a friendly.
Moved and seconded. Is that friendly?
It's moved and seconded. That's
Moved and seconded. Alan, you got to...
Well, instead of doing that, I'd rather do what Chris was talking about, which is leave it up to the discretion of the professional staff so they're going to be in the trenches, they're going to be making adjustments to these two projects, and I think we're running down as a little micromanaging of what that process would be. The likelihood that we'll get all this money and this project will look exactly like what we're talking about right now, I think is very slim, and so I would leave it up to Mark and his professional judgment of how to make this work and how to make both the bike ped parts and the road improvements parts work.
So in that case, you would not be supporting the motion amendment?
Was that an amendment, I guess?
Yes, it's an
It's
amendment.
an amendment.
Vote on that.
Okay, all those in favor of the amendment, please indicate. 3 in favor, in opposition. 5 in opposition, it does not pass. We're back to the main motion. All those in favor of the main motion? 4, 8, and none in opposition, it passes. And so, we are done. Thank you very, very much. Appreciate the conversation. All right, second item is the safe and efficient streets through access management. City Manager.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll just turn over to Peggy and get right into it.
Good evening.
I know, but...
A little over 3 years ago, the City Council asked staff to initiate some regulatory changes to the land use code, and that would allow us to implement access management on the arterial and collector streets. And I thought before next week's public hearings, I should explain to you a little bit about what has gone on over the last 3 years in the preparation for this ordinance that you're going to have the public hearing on next week. Can't go another year. So after that meeting in 2006, staff did some research. We looked at different access management codes and policies across the nation and put together a list of strategies that we felt were appropriate for the Eugene area. And after we had made the list of strategies, we then took it to a department advisory committee. That department advisory committee had an opportunity to look at the strategies and also work with some of those strategies in real cases in front of them. In the strategies themselves, there are only two primary things that we looked at. One was to reduce the number of conflict points on the arterial and collector street system, and then also to make sure that they were spaced far enough apart that the flow of the traffic on the arterial and collector streets could continue. In order to do that in an urban area where it's already developed, we found a lot of different conflicts, and as the Department Advisory Committee actually sat down, looked at the strategies, looked at how access management was implemented in other parts, they made several recommendations that we incorporated into our code development. But even through that process, we had a lot of different comments, and it was complex. We thought that it would be best not to write the code before we actually took those strategies to the Planning Commission. So from the DAC, we took the strategies to the Planning Commission, allowed them to look at those and weigh in, get a feeling as to whether or not they felt they were appropriate for this area. Then we developed the code. In each step of the way, what we did is we took a lot of input from the DAC, the Planning Commission, and we also met with several different interest groups. We had the realtors group, we had the commercial realtors, we had the home builders, the city group, and everyone had an idea of what they thought the code meant, and they gave us feedback along the way. And so we incorporated that into the code. In August, we sent out a letter to a little over 10,000 properties along the arterial and collector streets and let them know that this was coming up in the hearing. The hearing was held August 25th with the Planning Commission. We wanted them to know that this was going to change the land use side of it. It would not impact what their existing properties would look like. We do have existing code that allows us to close any unsafe driveway right now, but the new code was not going to do any changes on that. Only if you came in for a building permit or a land use application would the code be implemented on the properties. But we wanted people to understand that right up front. But we also wanted them to have an opportunity to bring in testimony. From that one mailing, we did receive a little over 200 phone calls. We worked with them. We looked at the code. We looked at how it would impact their property. And sometimes there were certain indicators that it didn't make sense, what we were proposing. So we did some more changes to the code. We've made several changes through this process and try to present a code that would still give us access management. It would allow us to reduce the number of access connections along the arterial and collector streets, and also it would separate those conflict points. We wanted to have enough spacing between the driveways that it would allow people to understand that when they were going to turn, it would be a definite turn. Because part of the conflicts that are occurring on our streets is that the driveways, the connections are so closely spaced that people are given false indications that they're going to be making a turn, and the drivers behind them don't know where it's going to be, and sometimes there's rear ends, but also it's they realize that they have so many different options, it's hard for the driver to understand what's doing. So when we looked at the strategies, we feel that we still have those strategies in place. We are reducing the number of driveway connections. We are spacing them. We are also, one other thing that's new to this code is that it will have an intersection influence area. And this seems to be one of the most important components of access management, that as people approach an intersection, they're free to actually work on concentrating on what they're doing in the intersection so they can make the stop and they can move through the intersection without the conflicting movements of those around them, whether or not they're going to pull into driveways. Another component that we wanted to make clear in this access management was that all development sites would have at least one connection to the arterial and collector system, if appropriate. Some that are on the corner, it may be more appropriate to have it on the side street of lower impact, but with certain study, they can actually still get it on the main street. And at that, I think I will open it up to questions.
Well, thank you for all that work. And I actually want to thank all the people who participated, too. It seems like you had a lot of participation.
We did.
Jennifer?
Thank you. This was really helpful that you would explain that, because what I read here wasn't very, it was hard to understand. First of all, you said here in the AIS there was a DAC and the member list was attached, and I didn't find that as a list in my attachments. And I would like to know who did serve on the Department Advisory Committee. And is the Access Management Citizen Involvement Plan, so the Planning Commission put together the plan for citizen involvement? Is that what that means?
Well, staff actually put together a citizen involvement plan. We presented that to the Planning Commission. They had their input. They gave us some guidelines as to what they would like to have involved in that process. And what it is that we were going to have a Department Advisory Committee. We met 4 or 5 times during the process, and then we would meet with interest parties in the process.
And then on the second page of the AIS, you mentioned here that at the September 14th meeting, staff met with the Planning Commission and provided them examples to demonstrate how the proposed code amendments would apply to different properties and locations. Was that a PowerPoint presentation, or was that poster board? Or because that would be really helpful for me to understand how what you're saying would apply to various intersections in town. When I think of access management, I think of what we did to the Rubensteins on the going from Coburg Road out to 126. And that, in my opinion, was a bad thing. So I associate anything with access management as being a bad thing.
Yeah.
But, so if I could see this, or you could present that to us, that'd be, I think, really helpful.
I think that we could probably do that. Take one example. What we did is we actually put up on the board a property, and then we kind of walked through the code itself so they could see how that property would be impacted by the proposed code. And we could do that, maybe 1-2 examples in the public hearing as we go into that.
I know that would be helpful for me. I don't want you to do it just for me, but if everybody else.
Sounds good. Yeah.
And actually, and if you could maybe do 3. That would be good. I just know that working on this other committee that I'm working on with Public Works around street assessments, Fred brought these fabulous maps to our last meeting that really did impose upon them how what we were discussing would affect those particular projects, and it was very helpful.
Okay.
And the list of members.
And the list of members.
In the list of members, I can make that available.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Other questions, comments? I don't see.
She got it. That was good.
You
did good.
Good job,
I
Sarah.
think everybody else needs graphics.
So I just want to clarify, so at the public hearing, what you'd like us to do is actually make a presentation, either pre or post-public hearing, and we can kind of work that out, that has some of these graphics and lay that out ahead of that. Okay.
More detail.
Probably be helpful for
Okay.
everyone, including whoever's there, right?
Mayor.
Yeah. Yes. Alan?
Yeah, I just wanted to underscore that. I think the visuals would be really helpful. And also underscore the fact that we've been working on this for over 3 years. So it is a large body of work. And thank you for slogging through this and all the different processes and all the different people that have participated in doing this. It's not uncomplicated, and it really impacts people's businesses and homes and properties. So it's a big deal. It's a pretty big deal, and it deserves our looking at it as well as reading it.
No problem. I think that one of the things that we saw as we went through the process and had people actually come in and ask us, this is my site, and how will it impact me? We could actually walk through it with them, and we found that there were only a very few, handful at the most, that actually had an impact that was real. And I will give you one example where a property owner was had in his mind all these years that he was going to have a driveway at this specific location, and it was a commercial site, and he wasn't convinced that with this new code that he could still develop. Well, he found that yes, he could develop. There were alternatives, but it would change how we made that development proposal. And in this case, the development is not coming in any near future. And if he had that opportunity, he could actually bring it in and be under the existing code, maybe get it where he proposed, thought that it was best. But he is seeing now that when he actually gets to development, he's going to have to move that driveway to the north a little bit more than he had planned. So those were the kinds of examples that
I think our experience is that as many people as came and asked you questions in the process, a lot of people don't really wake up to what's happening until you get to the hearing phase, and so it may be in something that seems to people as complicated as this, that you may want to have a few people there who can actually answer questions for people kind of offline, so to speak, because I'm sure that's what you'll have happen. So it might be helpful in that they get some of the same kind of experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right.
I'm going to
Yep.
do a little work there.
We want to, next is our work session. We have asked the city's independent police auditor, Mark Gisner, from time to time to come and report back to council on the work that he's been doing. And this is one of those evenings when he is coming to do report back to us. So we welcome you here.
Thanks. I suppose I couldn't stall for another 30 minutes or so.
Doesn't mean you have to take all the time, Mark.
And I've had some recent dental work, so if I sound a little bit like Fleshmouth Mariano Pachetti, my apologies. I'm not speaking very well today, so pardon me.
Yeah, I didn't get either.
Fleshmouth Mariano Pachetti. He was the longtime pizza eating champion in Cleveland until he got beat by a German Shepherd. A four-legged one, not a two-legged one.
Brought him all the way to Germany.
True story.
Cleveland humor.
So again, I'm having some difficulty speaking. Of course, we're here on a very serious matter. After the last case that was highly publicized and generated a lot of community interest, I got some feedback from council president, vice president, and other council members that they really didn't get a good feel for my decision-making processes, and I
think it's very important that you understand where I'm coming from since you hired me, and I'm going to speak in general terms about this case, so it's more about me today than it is about the particular details of the case, which will be discussed in more detail tomorrow at the Civilian Review Board meeting. But I wanted to let you know what processes and methodology I'd use to make some of the decisions that I made, so that you have a better understanding of your employee and whether you thought it was a good hire or not. So, having said all that, and I'll go to my notes, and I have a little bit more time, so I'll be patient with myself. As I said, I'm not going to talk specifically about the conduct of the individual officers or the decisions of the police chief. I will say that there were valuable lessons learned here. I hope they carry over to reduce the chances of similar occurrences, but I will try to touch on the main points of my methodology. In this case involving the students from China, on the night of the incident, I was contacted by Captain Stronach, who had given me details about what happened. As I recollect, the mayor was contacted, as well as Councilor Brown, since it was in his district. I did not expect to receive a complaint from either one of these individuals. Having spent some time in that part of the world, it seemed to me that it would be unlikely that they would complain, but I wanted to wait several days before I decided to initiate action. It was always on my radar. It was always foremost in my mind, but I wanted to see if there was going to be opportunities for the police or for some folks to come forward and mediate this. I'm permitted by the ordinance and charter to open cases, and several days after this happened, I decided to do that because I had not heard from them. It's entered into the computer as an allegation, I think initially as a use of force allegation, and I'll talk about a little bit some of the issues I have with the system that we have in terms of getting things out on that. When that happens, it's assigned to an investigator at Internal Affairs. I monitor the entire investigative process. We had some unusual challenges with interviewing the students because they spoke very little English, and so certainly want to commend the patience of the Internal Affairs investigator, because it was him, myself, two attorneys, and a translator. But I think we obtained the information from the students as best as we could. In addition, the officers involved were interviewed in my presence, as well as the manager of the apartment complex. There were tape recordings of the dispatch that I reviewed, as well as the taser video, which I found to be very helpful. During this process, we identified Eugene Police Department policies and procedures that we thought best applied to this case. That's one of the, I guess, hiccups in the system is as we start identifying, if you will, peripheral issues in a case. Sometimes they don't always get entered into the database system, which then for the officers, they may not think that there's another part of this that we're looking at. And so I think it's part of the system that we're working on now, so that early on in the process we try to identify not only the primary issue, but also the peripheral issues that were involved. In total, we identified 7 policies and procedures that were most appropriate for this case. I suppose there were a bunch of others that could fit in. As you all know, just like with your ordinances and your charters, things get added over the years, and so it starts to look like the New York phone book every time there's a new person that moves into town. But in terms of the order of it, it can be confusing. But we did identify 7 the most appropriate procedures. For me, these included the use of force policy, the taser policy, search and seizure policies, probable cause to detain, and the language competency policy. And under those categories, I don't think I named 7, but under those categories, there were 7 policies and procedures that we identified. I try to go in sequence a little bit in terms of then what we looked at. And I also wanted to add that we went to the apartment so we could view the scene and what it was like and what we would have thought the officers would have saw when they arrived there. And I did that on 2 occasions, one occasion with the internal investigator and another with the chief, the internal investigator, and myself. With regard to the entry to the apartment, my assessment was a little bit more difficult because there's a lack of specific policies on warrantless entries into homes in the current police department policies and procedures. They have broader constitutional rights policies, but my experience with policies and procedures is that the more specificity in policies, the better the officers understand their obligations and responsibilities. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later, but there was kind of a little bit of a disconnect for me to try to put a policy with that specific action. For these kinds of things, they're certainly constitutional issues. For a long time throughout my career, I've had maybe about 8 to 10 court cases in my toolbox, if you will, that are Supreme Court cases that speak about officers' responses to situations, but they're not so narrowly defined that they are only applied to very small things. They're usually broader in nature, but do have specific elements, such as warrantless entries into people's homes. On this particular issue, there was a case called Illinois versus Rodriguez, which discusses who has authority over a property and how to enter that property, and that was the assessment that I used in determining whether or not the officers had appropriately entered the property based on a reasonable belief that there were authority figures backed by other evidence that would cause a reasonable officer to believe that these authority figures had control over this property. And so that was the standard that I used in that particular case. And that, in addition, then segued into if they had control and authority over that property, and if there was someone in that property, then it naturally segues into anyone who would be in that property at that particular time would be there unlawfully. So that was what I used with regard to the entry into the property. And I'll talk again a little bit more about warrantless entries into homes and the policies. With regard to the use of force and the use of the taser, there's a case called Graham versus Connor that's been used for a long time, which establishes a reasonable standard to evaluate an officer's use of force. It's based on what they call a reasonable officer standard that evaluates the severity of the crime, whether the suspect poses an immediate threat to the safety of the officer or others, and whether the suspect actively resisted or attempted to evade police by flight. The EPD policy also articulates these basic standards. And so I evaluated this use of force based on my 20-plus years of experience from that reasonable officer standard. It was coincidental for the purpose of my evaluation that this particular officer was involved. Again, we're supposed to evaluate it from a reasonable officer standard without deference to the particular officer in this case. We're also supposed to evaluate it from a reasonable officer on the scene rather than 20/20 hindsight, and that the totality of circumstances is considered. There needs to be a recognition that officers are forced to make split-second decisions in circumstances that are tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving. I think it's a great case to use on our use of force cases, and I know it's under consideration as the Police Commission works on the use of force policy. In this particular case, because there were so few people involved, and I tried to give as much consideration as possible to the officer's statement and what he claimed he saw. It was obviously difficult for, I think, the student to be accurate in his assessment, as we now know that they had spent numerous hours, probably close to 24, traveling to Eugene. And for those of you who have made the cross-Pacific trip, or just to the west, not to mention I've made it across the east, it can have an effect on on your sleeping habits, and when you finally do get to sleep, I think it would put you into a deep sleep. As well as the officer's statement and trying to put that together with the students, I also reviewed the taser video, which I found to be very helpful. I think it's a good tool for the taser. It's not the panacea for all the evaluation of it, because it doesn't come on until stuff starts to happen. But I still think that it is a good view, or a good tool for that. So then, based on that, I tried to take all those standards that I had to do a determination about whether the threat assessment was reasonable under the totality of the circumstances, and I provided my analysis of that to the chief. I can talk about that. I want to talk about that more tomorrow night for the review board, because I know it's not council's responsibility with regard to individual officers and whether there shouldn't be discipline or not. And then the last policy they have, which isn't talked about too much, but there is a policy with regard to language competency and trying to use the tools that they have, which is a language line, to communicate with people. So we did look at that particular policy after things settled down, if you will. Then I thought that there were actions to implement that particular policy, but certainly that would have to occur when things have calmed down a little bit. With regard to some of the specific policy issues, again, I had some difficulty tying a specific police policy to a warrantless entry into home, because other than the statement about constitutional rights and obtaining search warrants, there was no specific policies on that. I've already shared with the chief some policies that I think in other cities that address that particular issue very well. I think we all appreciate the sanctity of our homes, and to not have those rights infringed upon. And we need to make sure that our officers have a very clear understanding, and in my opinion, spelled out in writing what their responsibilities are in those circumstances, not necessarily in this particular case, but in other cases that we've certainly dealt with, and I think the chief has an appreciation for that. And so I hope that that's addressed. From some other things, maybe just an opportunity for folks to ask some questions during some preliminary investigations of these things, but that's probably a less important issue. As I said, another thing that was important to me was the how we classify complaints. In other words, we may bring in an officer to talk about a particular use of force, and I think that was probably the important issue here initially, but then we started talking about the language proficiency policy and entering the home policies, and so we want to make sure as soon as possible that the officers from a due process standpoint understand all the issues that are being looked at, and that was something we learned as well. Certainly interaction with divergent populations is something that I think is very important to the chief, and we're going to try to work with groups to try to handle that better and try to reduce the times that something like this might occur again. We know that officers have 200,000 to 300,000 contacts minimum a year. It's unrealistic to think that all those contacts are going to go smoothly. But what we can try to do is reduce those by improving training and policy and procedures and thought processes with regard to these kinds of issues. Other than I could cite the specific policies, but that'd probably get a little bit boring. Be certain more than happy to share those. In addition, on our website, I've added the. I haven't talked about individual conduct, but I've added the recommendations with regard to policies and procedures that I gave to the chief, again, without talking about individual conduct.
All right. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you. So now it's, if you all have any questions or clarifications of the process that you went through. Yes.
Thank you, Mark, for coming and sharing this with us. I really appreciate you going and taking the time and bringing this to us. One of the things that I was kind of not clear about, and even though I sat on a lot of the committees that help form your position in the CRB, is there not, when a complainant comes to you, is there not any form of advocacy that happens from the volunteer community to help people through the process, or are you in your office pretty much taking on that role?
I don't think it's our responsibility to be an advocate. I think it's our responsibility to monitor and evaluate the investigative process and to make recommendations on trainings and policies and procedures. If there are weaknesses in the advocacy community, if people have opinions about that, just because they have opinions on that doesn't necessarily mean that that falls on our shoulders. There's lots of groups out there that ought to be advocating for folks, but we do not represent people in that role.
So the reason I ask this is because historically the Human Rights Commission had a component of advocacy that helped people process this, because I believe that coming forward, if you've had an interaction that's not positive with our police department, it's hard for people to get to that point where they'll come forward and talk to you. And I'm glad to hear that you feel that the office is not a role of advocacy, because that's my opinion also. But I still think that there needs to be, and this isn't within your office or your purview, but just as a general comment, I still think that we as a city need to be able to offer that in a sense to help people through the process. And not just through this process, but through any of the processes that we are involved in. I think that's one thing that we're lacking on, and I know that we used to have a program that was very good, and that's actually how I came to get involved with the city, is being in that role. And being an advocate doesn't mean that you do anything but help that person through that process. It isn't whether you have an opinion or good or bad. It's just this is how things are done. Because I think that at times when people, there are different people who may not feel comfortable coming forward and really saying anything, and would feel like these gentlemen here. There is a group, I'm sure, that I know that's working with them, and so they're finding that support through their own community, but a lot of people don't have that kind of support. So just a word to the wise, I guess, is what I really wanted to bring up.
Well, I want to make it clear, too, that we're advocates for a fair and thorough complaint process. We're advocates for making sure that the complaints are heard. We're advocates for ensuring that the investigations are thorough and complete and unbiased. And we're advocates for improving policies and procedures and community relations and trust in the police department. That's what we advocate for.
That's a lot, and I appreciate you clarifying that.
So just to follow up on that conversation a little bit, what I think is that you had your role, this particular case had its sort of law enforcement cycle it had to go through. And then I think in large part because our Human Rights Commission has gone through a significant change and we have all new people and they're being trained and brought up to speed and all of that. But I do think in a case like this, they should have been in action on day one too. So I think both of those parts of us need to be happening as a city. Or all three, I guess. It's the auditing process, it's the police investigatory process, and it's the HRC process. Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mayor. This is no reflection on what the HRC isn't doing, and I'm very aware of their challenges right now, and I expect them to be working at full board here in a minute. But just out of curiosity, that's why I asked that question.
I think they've already come forward themselves and acknowledged that they need to be involved in these things, and they've been over working on the case at the university's been dealing with. So I think they are going to get up to speed really fast. Other questions? Mike?
Yeah, I was just wondering, George and I get to have the opportunity to be the liaisons for the police commission, and I know that there was a CRB liaison to the police commission change there. So my question is, do you think that all the systems are in place adequately for us to bring any of these other pieces to police commission to develop policy appropriately to suggest to the chief with regard to warrantless entry and any of the pieces about language competency? You feel good that the police commission can get that addressed appropriately?
Yes. Sometimes things have to move a little bit more quickly. And a good example was the Ninth Circuit Court's decision on the taser policy. And correct me if I'm wrong, Chief, that they had a pretty rapid policy directive that covered those particular components. I'm hopeful that the issue of warrantless entries into homes is done expeditiously, but again, it's a very important issue, and I think it needs to be crystal clear to the officers, not just in training, but in their policy manuals. I want them to be able to go home or go to the office if something happens in the course of an evening or something, that they can go back and look at that and think about the things that they did or the things that, or the best way they could have approached a problem. I know, well, I came here in June, and I know we're still talking about the taser policy, and so sometimes there are some key elements that probably need to be pushed through a little bit quicker.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Hey, George?
Thanks, Mark. I just wanted to thank you for going to bat for the students and for filing a complaint on their behalf, because had you not done that, it wouldn't have gone down a memory hole, but I don't think we'd be having the robust conversation that the subject merits had you not done that. I was the only council member that was informed, was in my ward. And I found that out. I asked, nobody was talking about it in town. That disturbed me. I thought it was a pretty big deal. It just shocked me. And the chief didn't mention it in his report at the police commission. And he had his reasons, and I'm not going to second guess his reasons or criticize him for that. I think it's great. I think his identification of the problems and steps to take care of them is really good. And he just nailed the main problems, kind of like you did. And the recommendations that you've made to the department, I think they're all spot on, and I support all of them. And I think those are things we need to do right away. So I just wanted to thank you for all that. And the Human Rights Commission didn't know about it. They weren't informed. I'm the one that brought it up at one of the meetings. That's how they became informed. It was like 3 or 4 weeks after it happened. They were discussing another taser case. I said, well, did anyone hear about this one? And so that's kind of how that happened. And I think out of this that we do need a good, clear policy for warrantless entries. That's not the first time that that's happened. I know of one other case that the CRB reviewed last year. That's 2 cases in, about a year. And probably were other ones that never made it to to the complaint stage. So it's important to have a real clear policy for the officers. So, the subcommittee on use of force, maybe next time, but they should be done with their recommendation for the changes for the TASER policy. So they'll be meeting this week? 18th. Okay, yeah. And I'm hoping that'll be their last meeting, but if they need another one, that's fine too. Thanks.
Yeah, we got a little, there was actually the different judges just ruled on another TASER case in Hawaii that their analysis is, I don't know if I'll say markedly different, but it's certainly different than the previous one. And so I feel sorry for our officers and our administrators to try to understand it, because quite frankly it was different than the one before that, and it just came out a couple weeks ago. So
Do you know the name of the...
I forget. I have it back at the office.
Was it
It was a Hawaiian name. So
Hawaii Supreme Court? Or
no, it
or
was the Ninth Circuit.
Ninth Circuit again.
Yeah, they were. They.
You get us that, Mark? Would you send us that reference, please?
Yeah.
Thanks.
It was different.
Yeah.
So, and the last one I remember was just was the one I had back in 1987 that the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled. But those are about the only 3 that have been specifically addressing TASER issues, in not just for that specific incident, but in a broader sort of sense, I think, which was helpful.
George, are you?
The Ninth Circuit, the first Ninth Circuit, I think went a very good distance in raising the subject threshold of behavior to warrant TASER use, and so it'll be good if we can incorporate that into the new guidelines. I guess that's all. Thank you.
Alan, you're next.
So, Mark, thank you for that thoughtful description of your process, and thank you for handling this. I think you handled it very well and very appropriately. It confirms that I think we picked the right person for the job. So thank you for all of that. I also appreciate your description of your role, and especially the enumerated advocacy roles that you have. But Andrea brings up a different advocacy role, which is kind of like what CASA does, the court-appointed, I forget what the S stands for, special advocates for children going through a process that's sometimes arcane and difficult. And I know when that happens and you're in the middle of it, it's difficult for you to play that role, and maybe that's something that the city needs to look into, is providing to citizens who find themselves in this circumstance. And so the issues that you and policies that you forward to the chief for clarification and additional work were warrantless entry policy,
Yes.
some constitutional issues, the Rodriguez case in particular, reasonable use of force, the language proficiency policy, and also how we classify complaints.
Yes.
Did I
Yeah.
miss something?
Yeah. Probably there was 1 or 2 that was more officer specific, so I'd rather wait until tomorrow to talk about that. But those were the primary issues in this particular case. Yeah.
So how does that play out? How do those?
Well, the
go
CRB's authorized to review, and discuss the chief's adjudications and whether or not they agree with them or not on the specific officer conduct. And so they'll have an opportunity probably to discuss elements of the case specifically about the officer's conduct, where it's not necessarily, this isn't the forum with the council, if you will. So they'll be more in tune, I guess, with discussing the specific allegations with regard to the officer conduct. hopefully they'll also look at the training and policy recommendations as well. And then again, the thoroughness and completeness of the investigative process.
Yeah, what I meant was what happens to those policy issues that you forward onto the chief? How does that what does the chief do with them? How does it get resolved?
Well, some of them, again, and I don't know if it was directly involved with this case, but like the Ninth Circuit case, he certainly needed to issue a policy directive. I think the other ones, he's probably better at answering the questions. He knows it's important to me. His training supervisor, Sergeant Long, knows it's important to me, and based on the experience that I've had, there's usually like 8 or 9 areas that are really important nationwide on policy issues. So certainly one of those is going into folks' homes, and so I hope we can fast track that. But he's probably better at answering that particular question.
Can we get the chief to answer that question?
Can I answer that, Chief?
Sure.
He needs a microphone, though. Since you're here.
The question of that policy is in the queue with many other policies that are important to us. I think the most important, so we will be addressing our entry into policies regarding warrantless entry into residences. In a memorandum to the division manager in charge of policy and internal affairs, I directed that that policy gets into review soon. We've also contracted with an attorney who is providing ongoing training to our officers over and above what the district attorney's office provides in search and seizure and other legal matters. So we're being pretty aggressive this year, and it'll be ongoing in the future to train our officers in this area.
Good. I know you've been very aggressive in upping the training and getting these kind of issues in front of officers. So thank you for doing that.
Alan, is that it for
Yes.
you? Okay, Chris.
Thank you. I very much appreciate the presentation, and I want to reinforce what I believe I'm hearing as the tone that you're taking in terms of not only your work, but also the relationship and the work you're having with the chief and the police department, as well as the Civilian Review Board. I think it's important that we focus on the best possible outcomes and try to make this process geared towards achieving good outcomes, which are process improvements, reviews of policies, making things better than they were before. I think that's really what your goal is, and I believe that's also what the chief's goal is. And as long as we can stay on that side of the discussion, then we're moving together to try to get to that outcome. I can remember way back when I first ran for the school board, a high school student asked me if I understood the difference between discipline and punishment. And I thought it was very intriguing that, discipline, which comes from the same root as disciple or student, it's learning. Discipline is learning. You're teaching somebody something so they can do better. Punishment, from the same root as punitive, or just to do something to hurt somebody for your own satisfaction, is not what we want. We're not seeking punishment here. We're not seeking to try to get revenge or to say, you did something wrong and therefore I'm going to hit you over the head. If we are seeking discipline, we're seeking discipline from the standpoint of we want a disciplined, effective, organized department. I think that's what everybody wants. And the degree to which you can assist that process, I think, is what we want. So I appreciate you're approaching this from the standpoint of saying, what do we need to do to learn? And as long as we keep the emphasis on learning and improving, I think we'll achieve the best outcomes. And so I like that you take the time to say, here's some things that we've discovered that need to be worked on. Here's some stuff that needs to be looked at, changed. I don't have to be the one that looks at them. The chief can be the one that looks at them. But these are things that can make the system better. To me, that's the highest ideal of disciplining your way to a good place. And hopefully we can maintain that tone, because I think that is exactly where we want to be.
Thanks, Chris. That was well said. Jennifer?
Thank you. Mark, that was really a helpful presentation from you.
You're welcome.
And I think that Alan and Chris's questions sort of get to where my question is, and that is, it sounds like training is an issue here. And if the officers aren't being trained for all circumstances, then how can they be violation of a policy? Does that make sense?
Sure, and probably one coming down the pike soon will have that same dilemma. This would have been a tough one to predict and put into a textbook before it happened. And only in Eugene, I
Should be
can't
our
think of anything anywhere close that I've had, and I've seen some bizarre cases in my career, but this was certainly unusual. Having said all that, there's still certain expectations we have when people conduct threat assessments, and I think those things are being treated. And I think in a broader sense on entry into homes, I know there is some training, but I don't. It's not where I want it to be, because one of the things that troubled me about this was it was never really an issue in the chain of command. The taser and the use of force was certainly on the radar screen, but there wasn't much discussion whether validation or lack of validation about something, again, that's very important to me, which is going into people's homes. And so, getting to your point, then there seems to be that there must be some sort of disconnect internally if that doesn't come to the forefront of the minds of folks who have supervisory roles for our police officers. So again, that's something that's got to be part of the discussion as well, is that that light bulb should immediately come on in folks' head and say, we also need to talk about this in this particular case, because these young men ought to have answers to this issue. So that's the learning process.
Thank you. Betty?
Thank you. First, I think it's good that you are here, Mark, to talk to us, and I hope we will do this regularly. I have a question left over for the attorney. Some time ago, you were going to find out whether we could put a moratorium on the use of tasers. And
Yes, but if you want to do that, you need to do it by an ordinance, and the council could do that.
we could do that.
Yes.
Okay. I personally think we should do that until we have a better policy. But going ahead, in the case of the Van Ornum incident, were there policies? What policies were involved, and could different policies have made that incident different, or would adherence to current policies have made it different? I assume you've looked at that, even though you weren't here at the time.
I wasn't prepared for that question. I suppose at some point in time I could talk about the policies I reviewed in that particular case. I'm not prepared to answer those right now, because I'm afraid I might leave something out or miss something. It was different, and so if council has a sense to schedule something under the same or similar sort of circumstances, I don't have an issue with that, but that would be up to you guys to decide.
So you could tell us about that at another time? About policies that might be...
If we requested it.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm requesting it. And about entry into homes, are you thinking of broader than just this kind of incident? I think sometimes that people's homes are entered because someone has a suspicion, and then they find that maybe their suspicion was right, but does it make a difference if it turns out to be right?
Well, there's a number of different approaches. They have a policy on warrant entries into homes. They have, the state has the, and I get the terminology wrong, community caretaking thing in which, actually we'll have a case coming up that involves that pretty soon, in which if there's reasonable belief that there's an emergency occurring in that home, that they can enter, and then there's ones in which they have reasonable cause to believe that the bad guy's in the home. So there's a number of different circumstances involved with warrantless entries into homes. So some of the policies are pretty good on it. Some of them not so much. So I know that he's having his attorney look at all those specific issues, but this is one for me in terms of the warrantless entries into homes that I've kind of put on the front burner.
Okay, thank you.
The ones on warrantless searches, I think those are more of a warrant that's obtained from a judge is a little bit different circumstance for us, because the judge makes the decision about whether or not a warrant to search should be issued.
Thank you.
So, again, we want to thank you for your presentation tonight, and I guess that I'd like to wind this up, because I feel like every time we talk about this case, we need to say this, and that is just to reiterate that there was nothing at fault with the students in this case, and that they were the innocent victims of misidentification. And I think we all share, all of us, every person of us that's involved in this in any way, are very, very sorry that this happened to these students. And I guess we cannot say that often enough, or more to our community, because it's a very important thing out there in the community for it to be recognized. The students, we're talking about how we handle what happened, but in fact, they are the people that had nothing to do with this. So with that, thank you very much, and we'll see you when you come back to report again.
Thank you, Mark. You got enough big enough font there?